You might think of this prophecy from Zechariah when we come to that part of the church's year, Holy Week, when we hear the accounts of the passion and death of Jesus. Listen to how Jesus' entry into Jerusalem follows closely the pattern that the Word of God gave us through the words of the prophet. It's interesting that what Zechariah describes is not what one might expect for the entry of a king or of a leader. I mean, let's face it, a donkey is not a military mount. You might remember that famous painting of Napoleon on the horse, reared back. The horse is this majestic animal, and if we imagine a conquering king entering the city, that's probably the picture we have. Not a donkey. The donkey is not what we imagine, probably, if we're talking about the entry of a new power. Imagine the presidential seal of these states united with a donkey on it. We might do that for humor, maybe, depending on our own opinion of who happens to be seated in the Oval Office at this particular moment. Either way, it doesn't matter. That's not what we think of, probably, when we think of a majestic animal. One that might communicate to us in symbols that we can understand strength, power, might, victory. And yet, the words of the prophet Zechariah suggest that is exactly what would happen when the Messiah entered into reign. And now we as Christians know, when we look at the accounts of Holy Week, that this is exactly what happened. Christ did not enter his city as a conquering hero, as in at the head of an army, as in having taken victory, and the city being the prize. He enters in an entirely other way. Why does it matter? In many ways, then as now, there are people who genuinely believe in a system that is based on extraction. And certainly in the ancient world, and in many ways even today, the figure of a king is a figure of extraction. What Zechariah is trying to counter is the image of a king whose subjects work for the glory of the crown. What the subjects produce enriches not the kingdom, not the nation, but the king. This was one of the warnings that Samuel gave to the people of Israel when they asked for a king like other nations. Samuel confronts him and says, listen, you don't understand. If you have a king, it becomes your responsibility to support the king and the royal family and the palace and the army and expect nothing in return. There's no contract between king and country. The king takes and the subjects give. And that is the way of things. The subjects of the nation produce so that the king and those closest might live in greater opulence, in greater luxury. And it is the privilege of the subject to contribute to the welfare of the crown. Not the nation, the crown. It was one of the problems in and around Jerusalem that led, at least in part, to the fall of the kingdom. That the king after king after king for generations took and offered nothing, promised nothing. Zechariah presents a different model and says, this is not what your king shall be. Not a conquering hero. Not someone who extracts, but someone who provides peace and a prosperity that is earned by our own work, not toil. Fruitful, productive work. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and find life wearisome, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon yourselves and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart." Jesus offers a different vision of what he as king might provide. Not the kind of wealth that empowers us to be lazy and do nothing. My yoke is easy, my burden light. There's still a yoke and there's still a burden. We don't get off the hook, so to speak. But rather what Christ promises is a fruitful and productive labor that we don't see as a burden, but rather as a joy. That we get to do things and do them well and see them prosper. We heard that kind of thinking in our opening song too. God who grants prosperity, who prospers the work of our hands. Christ doesn't want simply to take from us. Christ wants us to live in a space in which we can enjoy well the fruits of the labor that we have put in. That we get to keep and use and share what we do. That's the light burden. We need to be productive by grace. We need to share what God's work in us has accomplished. But to do so in a way that is life-giving and life-sharing, animated by the Spirit of God, of which Paul spoke to the Romans. The Spirit of God that gives life to us all. A new and different kind of life. Under a king who wants to reign not over us in the sense of extraction or dominion, but reign for us as one who gives life.